Hi. Let's see if this works. Oh, look, I see audio and it's all stretched out. Oh no, settings have been muddled. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Apparently, I needed a restart to fix things. Have you tried turning it off and on again? I had not. Let's see if I can unstretch this a little. How did I do that last time? Was it literally just by like mucking? No, it's not that. And it looks like no chat. What? Chat? Where'd you go, chat? Chat should be here somewhere. Why'd that stop? Oh boy. You think it's behind it. Okay, let's see if I can... Oh yeah. Oh. What? Folder? Man, what's going on here? Should be this one. Let's see if I can move up. Did that do it? No. Oh, that just moved it up the list. Is that it? How many chat things do I have here? There it is. Okay. There's the chat sorted. Didn't understand how that worked before, but now I do. Now let's see. How's everyone doing? Is anybody actually still here? Other than Farm Mouse. I saw Edgar Perez comment. Well, it says Books, Brews, and Booze is still in the chat. Sharkies are here too. Hello, everybody. I'm just trying to sort out... I had some technical difficulties, and now I've got to unstretch myself, because... it should be here. Custom... What? Why? Oh, cancel that. Why would that even show up? Oh boy. That's normal, that's normal. That's normal. I don't think this should exist. Try and get rid of that. Hopefully it doesn't ruin everything. Long, busy day for the Sharkies. Do you get to relax on the weekend at all? Yeah. We are getting out of our... Oh, that's not right. Why does that make me just vanish? Sorry, I'm mucking with the resolution a little bit, trying to unstretch things. Whoa. How's this? No, still looks stretchy. No, that's not right. Work tomorrow, and the weekend includes 2 birthday parties and a Zoom meeting. Oh boy. Okay, let's try that again. Hmm. That doesn't do it at all. I don't know why the resolution for this camera seems real wonky sometimes. Just getting it to not be all zoomed in and not be stretched out. Hmm. Is apparently an issue. Okay, well, 640 by 480 seems to be sort of a custom default. Let's see. That didn't do it at all. Maybe I should just leave it stretched out for today and fix it later, and that way you guys don't have to watch me mucking around like this. That seems like a good idea. Let's do that. Alright, so today's stream is going to look a little wonky. It's fine. You don't know how you kept such a busy schedule in the before times? Yeah. Ugh. Ugh, it looks so stretched out. Could do something like this, and that doesn't even unstretch it though, does it? It just makes it smaller. Smaller and stretched, yeah. Ah well. Can I... This, no. Even that, just mini, yeah. Yeah, we're just getting out of the house entirely this weekend because we've got open houses. Our realtor is showing off our house to strangers, and we don't want to be here for that. So we're just going out of town for the weekend. Do not like this stretched image. I'm sorry, everyone. I look weird. Yeah. So, doing some last minute cleaning and tidying. I don't know how much I have told everyone here about the saga of our gaming table. I'm sure I've shown off pictures and things, but after like 3 years, it is finally sitting in our garage in this massive box that is extremely heavy because I had to push it out of the way so that I could get the car into the garage. And I couldn't push it, but I could pivot it out of the way. I tried just to get my shoulder on it and push, but my feet were sliding instead of the box. It's just been a hassle in that we ordered this table like 3 years ago, shortly after we moved into this house, And in that time, we've had a space set for the table. We've got a room, a small room where, like, I'm all out of focus now, but it doesn't matter because I'm all stretched out anyway. We had a room set up where the table's going to go. We put a temporary table in that space more recently, just a folding table, so that we could play some games in there. And so we've had this room set up for 3 years. Like, you know, it had some junk in the space in the meantime because we were waiting for the table anyways. And then the guy that's making it, like, his work is beautiful. Everything that we've seen, all the pictures and everything, and he sent us like a sample. Like, he sent us this little dice tower and stuff. And his work is gorgeous. But he would just, like, not respond to us. We'd have to prompt him repeatedly. There was a period of time where he wasn't responding to Farmouse, who was the one in contact, so I sent him a message, and then he responded to me, and I was like, hey, answer her. Especially because he took a down deposit when he took our order. A down payment. He took a down payment. A down deposit, oh boy. And so it's just been this huge hassle communicating with this guy, and it keeps getting delayed. And like when we initially ordered it, you know, he gave us a time frame which was much shorter, and then, you know, over time he'd be like, okay, you know, it's going to be done in about a month, and then, you know, 3 months pass before we hear from him again, and oh, he's had some problems, blah blah blah, it's not finished yet, he's got to work out something with it's got sort of a rail around the outside of the table that, like, some accessories can slot into. He's got to work out problems with the rail and things like that, and just issue after issue after issue. And so now it's been like 3 years, and we're selling our house, and now is when the table shows up. So it's just been this, like, we're very happy to finally have the table, but we're not even going to unbox it. It's just going to go into storage until we have a new place. And once we're there, it'll be the first thing to get moved in, I'm sure, right? We'll find out where we're going to put it, and it's going to go into place, and then we'll be able to get some chairs to go around it and whatever. But it's just been such a hassle. And it's just funny that we've had a space for it for 3 years, and now that we finally cannot put it in that space because we're moving, that's when we get it. So that's the saga of the table. Yeah, I mean, we've seen pictures of the finished product. We haven't actually seen it physically because it's all packed up in that box, and there's no way that we're going to unpack it. But this is the pictures we were sent before it got packed up. So that's it. It's got sort of leaves that go on top to make it just a table. It's made out of hard maple, and it's stained that, like, dark chocolate color. And then if you take the leaves off the top and the drawers come out, it's got a felt lining inside. It's got cup holders built in. It's got little spaces for pencils and things in the edges for everyone. The drawers, you can see, have, like, electrical outlets. The drawers that are pulled out have electrical outlets with USB ports inside each one, so everyone can have, like, space to plug stuff in. You can see the stuff around the outside there. Those are, like, I was talking about the rail system. So there's spots for writing surfaces and, like, people to roll dice and things like that, or hold their pencils, or set up cards. You can, like, have little card holders if you've got cards and things. Yeah, and the actual interior space is supposed to be, we measured it out so that the interior space would be big enough to, like, play a game of Warhammer, or things like that. So it'll be good for tabletop gaming, as well as, like, you know, D&D and stuff is really the primary intention. I'm happy that it's got those, like, cup holders built in. It's kind of neat. So everyone sitting there should have their own cup holder. It's funny to, like, look at this picture and go, yep, it's finally here. It's sitting in the garage right now. So when I can finally get my Curse of Strahd game going up again, I'll be able to run it on this fancy, shiny new table. And yeah. And yeah, like Farmo says, we haven't gotten chairs to go around it yet because we wanted to set it up in this space, be able to see, okay, what height are people going to need to sit at? How much space do we have for chairs around the table? Hopefully, because our group tends to play quite long games of D&D. Like, we'll set aside a day and we'll play for 8 or more hours, which is, I don't think, how most groups do things. Maybe, I don't know. I kind of, it's just how our friends have always done it. And so we definitely need comfortable chairs that you can sit in for long periods of time without, hurting your butt. You've done a 6-hour session? Yeah, I think we've done like 12. I mean, there are breaks in there, right? And we like pause and have dinner and things like that. Depending on the day, sometimes we'll even like cook something fancy. But more often we just, order burritos or something like that, or pizza. But yeah, I mean, the primary reason we went with this guy is because his work was beautiful, and like Farmo says, we were able to work with him to make it like custom to our specifications. We were able to say, we want cup holders, we want writing surfaces, we want it to be this size. So it's expensive. It was an expensive table, but it's also made out of hard maple, so it should hopefully last forever. With the kids, you can spare about 3 hours for a session. I mean, honestly, I think 3 hours is more standard, and like that's a reasonable amount of time. And another thing with our group of friends is that we don't always meet very consistently. People's work or school or whatever kind of getting in the way, and sometimes we just kind of get burnt out or whatever. So we're not great at. So I think that's part of it, is it feels like a more of a rare occurrence for us to all get together to game, and so when we do, we just try and make the absolute most out of it. Which is probably not the best way to do it. I would imagine a more consistent schedule would be probably a bit superior to longer sessions. So, we read one chapter, chapter 9, on Wednesday, and we said we were going to read 2 today. The last chapter wasn't too exciting. It was a bit of talking from various characters. Hetar went off on his own and killed some Murgos, but we didn't actually get to see that fight. He just sort of came back whistling to himself. Barak was a little hurt that he didn't get to go along. Yeah, scheduling games does seem to be like the most challenging part. Although also just running games, like I have to keep myself like being one of the regular GMs for our group. I have to keep myself inspired, I guess. It's like I can get something similar to writer's block, where it's difficult to feel like enthusiastic about running a game. Like I'm not there right now, but it happens where your enthusiasm for keeping a game going gets lower and lower, and it starts to feel like a chore. So I'd say those are the 2 hardest things, is like keeping the enthusiasm for a particular game and actually scheduling everybody to get together. So yeah, in the last chapter, Garion learned about some of the dangers of sorcery. That you shouldn't commit yourself to a sorceress working that you cannot complete, because you could expend all of your energy and not be able to keep your heart beating, and that you should never ever try to unmake something. You can change something. For instance, if you want someone dead, you could change them from alive to dead through various methods, but you cannot cause something to cease to exist. And as Mr. Wolf said, if you want to kill someone, you're better off just going and sticking your sword in them. Yeah. And Garion and Princess Sinedra had one of their fights. That was before Hetar was missing. And they are 4 or 5 days from the Vale, is where we finished. So we're on chapter 10 on page 106. In my copy, it's just about 7:30. You wonder if magic in this world could change someone's atoms from forming a human to forming a cloud, for example. Possibly. Yeah, we haven't seen a huge variety. Let's see, we've seen a twig grow into a tree. We've possibly seen a rose get created. Maybe from nothing, but we don't know for sure. Because we didn't actually... Well, I mean, we have... towards what you're saying, like, it's not unmaking the person, but functionally effective. I mean, likewise, we've seen a person get turned into ash through fire. So, but that was not exactly the same because the form of the person didn't get really changed. It's just the person got lit on fire and continually burned, kind of from the inside out, it seemed like. So that's not precisely the same thing. But yeah, we've seen things get created, potentially. We've seen a twig grow. We've seen locks get picked with magic. Apparently things can be moved. We've seen something get teleported. We've seen someone get teleported, actually. Translocated. So, I mean, in theory, someone could get translocated out into space. Because it does sound like space exists. It's kind of weird to think of in, like, in D&D, in some worlds, like, can you go to outer space in D&D? I don't know. That's a weird question. And I think it depends on what plane of existence you're on. Yeah. But we haven't really, oh, and we have seen a person get transformed into a snake. Or a wolf or an owl. Which the weird thing about the owl is, I'm guessing it's not an owl with the same mass as a person. So that's a little odd, isn't it? Just realized I poured myself a drink and I think I left it in the kitchen. Just a sec. There it is. I'm back. So we have seen some people get transformed in various ways. Though, with the exception of the burning, we haven't seen a person get transformed into an inanimate state. And the burning even then seems a little kind of like an exception. We haven't really seen anything in the way of like a magical battle yet, have we? The closest to that is Asherak or Chamdar or whatever's shadow getting sent away. The burning, yeah, the burning was more like creating fire on a person and then having the fire take care of the change of state. Alright, so why don't I see if we can actually get into the Vale of Aldor, huh? Everybody ready? Yeah, the translocation, moving the person. All right, I'm going to get into it. Chapter 10. The weather, which had seemed on the brink of winter in the higher mountains, softened back into autumn as they rode down from the peaks and ridges. The forests in the hills above Maragor had been thick with fir and spruce and heavy undergrowth. On this side, however, the dominant tree was the pine, and the undergrowth was sparse. The air seemed drier, and the hillsides were covered with high, yellow grass. Yeah, Maragor had that spicy air. They passed through an area where the leaves on the scattered bushes were bright red. Then, as they moved lower, the foliage turned first yellow, then green again. Garion found this reversal of the seasons strange. It seemed to violate all his perceptions of the natural order of things. By the time they reached the foothills above the Vale of Aldor, it was late summer again, golden and slightly dusty. Although they frequently saw evidences of the Murgo patrols which were crisscrossing the region, they had no further encounters. After they crossed a certain undefined line, there were no more tracks of Murgo horses. They rode down beside a turbulent stream which plunged over smooth, round rocks, frothing and roaring. The stream was one of several forming the headwaters of the Aldor River, a broad flow running through the vast Belgarion plain to empty into the Gulf of Cherek, 800 leagues to the northwest. The Aldor River, huh? Let's see if we can spot that on the map. Rivers are usually... Oh yeah, there it is. So, it looks like this whole river that... get this over here. That comes this way and down and then splits all down here. That's the Aldor River. So it kind of circles the Vale, and it looks like they're probably crossing like a tributary or a branch of it down here, I would guess. Person was also high, been lurking, but was eating s'mores. You and Sharkies both got s'mores this week. I didn't get s'mores. I want s'mores. But I think I kind of mentioned this before. I don't really feel the need to make s'mores in my house. I prefer to make them over a campfire. Hermos has cookies, but they are in the kitchen, and she has a puppy snuggling her, so she can never move ever again. That is a dilemma. All right. So, right. The stream was one of several forming the headwaters of the Aldor River. So that's what it says there. This stream is not the actual Aldor River. It's one of the headwaters. So I guess it actually is flowing in the other direction. The streams come together to form the Aldor River that flows until the Gulf of Cherek. Although it's funny, I kind of lose track of it. Oh, I see. It's hard to tell on this map because it flows into the crease and then it follows the crease all the way and then empties up here in the Gulf of Cherek. It doesn't come out this way. It goes... Because it sort of looks like it vanishes, right? It comes up and then it just disappears. But I guess it comes all the way up along here and then empties out right here. Flows north like the Nile. The Nile flows north. You know, I didn't know that. I don't know why that feels a little odd. I think I just, anytime I saw it on a map, I imagined it flowing south. So let's see. They rode down beside a turbulent stream which plunged over smooth, round rocks, frothing and roaring. The stream was one of several forming the headwaters of the Aldor River, a broad flow running through the vast Belgarion plain to empty into the Gulf of Cherak, 800 leagues to the northwest. The third time I've read that sentence. The Vale of Aldor was a valley. Yeah. Lying in the embrace of the two mountain ranges which formed the central spine of the continent. It was lush and green, covered with high grass and dotted here and there with huge, solitary trees. Deer and wild horses grazed there, as tame as cattle. Skylarks wheeled and dove, filling the air with their song. As the party rode out into the valley, Garion noticed that the birds seemed to gather wherever Aunt Pole moved, and many of the braver ones even settled on her shoulders, warbling and trilling to her in welcome and adoration. "I'd forgotten about that," Mr. Wolf said to Garion. "It's going to be difficult to get her attention for the next few days." "Oh?" "Every bird in the Vale is going to stop by to visit her. It happens every time we come here. The birds go wild at the sight of her." That's cute. Aunt Pole is a Disney princess. Out of the welter of confused bird sound, it seemed to Garion that faintly, almost like a murmuring whisper, he could hear a chorus of chirping voices repeating, "Polgara, Polgara, Polgara." "Is it my imagination, or are they actually talking?" he asked. "I'm surprised you haven't heard them before," Wolf replied. "Every bird we've passed for the last 10 leagues has been babbling her name." "Look at me, Polgara, look at me," a swallow seemed to say, hurling himself into a wild series of swooping dives around her head. She smiled gently at him, and he redoubled his efforts. "I've never heard them talk before," Garion marveled. "They talk to her all the time," Wolf said. "Sometimes they go on for hours. That's why she seems a little abstracted sometimes. She's listening to the birds. Your aunt moves through a world filled with conversation." "I didn't know that." "Not many people do." The colt, who had been trotting rather sedately along behind Garion as they had come down out of the foothills, went wild with delight when he reached the lush grass of the vale. With an amazing burst of speed, he ran out over the meadows. He rolled in the grass, his thin legs flailing. He galloped in long, curving sweeps over the low, rolling hills. He deliberately ran at herds of grazing deer, startling them into flight and then plunging along after them. "Come back here!" Garion shouted at him. "He won't hear you," Hatar said, smiling at the little horse's antics. "At least, he'll pretend that he doesn't. He's having too much fun." "Get back here right now!" Garion projected the thought a bit more firmly than he'd intended. The colt's forelegs stiffened, and he slid to a stop. Then he turned and trotted obediently back to Garion, his eyes apologetic. "Bad horse!" Garion chided. The colt hung his head. "Don't scold him," Wolf said. "You were very young once yourself." Garion immediately regretted what he had done, or what he had said, and reached down to pat the little animal's shoulder. "It's all right," he apologized. That's not really an apology, is it?
The colt looked at him gratefully and began to frisk through the grass again, although staying close. Princess Senedra had been watching him. She always seemed to be watching him for some reason. She would look at him, her eyes speculative, and a tendril of her coppery hair coiled about one finger, and raised absently to her teeth. It seemed to Garion that every time he turned around, she was watching and nibbling. For some reason he could not quite put his finger on. It made him very nervous. Bingo! I have talked to my friend about getting those done. I've actually commissioned some emotes to be made, so hopefully those won't take too long. Although the bingo one I can do myself. That one, you know. It made him very nervous. If he were mine, I wouldn't be so cruel to him, she accused, taking the tip of the curl from between her teeth. Garion chose not to answer that. As they rode down the valley, they passed 3 ruined towers, standing some distance apart, and all showing signs of great antiquity. Those were probably on the map of the Vale of Aldor. I can find the right page. It'll be a little earlier than this. There we go. 3 ruined towers. Those would be the ones right here that they're passing. These 3. Belmakor, Belsambar, Belzadar. Standing some distance apart and all showing signs of great antiquity. Each of them appeared to have originally been about 60 feet high, though weather and the passage of years had eroded them down considerably. The last of the 3 looked as if it had been blackened by some intensely hot fire. Was there some kind of war here, grandfather? Garion asked. No, Wolf replied, rather sadly. The towers belonged to my brothers. That one over there was Belsambar's, and the one near it was Belmakor's. They died a long time ago. I didn't think sorcerers ever died. They grew tired, or maybe they lost hope. They caused themselves no longer to exist. They killed themselves? In a manner of speaking. It was a little more complete than that, though. Garion didn't press it, since the old man appeared to prefer not to go into details. What about the other one? The one that's been burned? Whose tower was that? Belzadar's. Did you and the other sorcerers burn it after he went over to Torak? No, he burned it himself. I suppose he thought that was a way to show us that he was no longer a member of our brotherhood. Belzadar always liked dramatic gestures. Where's your tower? Farther on down the vale. Will you show it to me? If you like. Does Aunt Pole have her own tower? No. She stayed with me while she was growing up, and then we went out into the world. We never got around to building her one of her own. Thousands and thousands of years, and they never got around to it. They rode until late afternoon and stopped for the day beneath an enormous tree, which stood alone in the center of a broad meadow. The tree quite literally shaded whole acres. Sinedra sprang out of her saddle and ran toward the tree, her deep red hair flying behind her. "He's beautiful!" she exclaimed, placing her hands with reverent affection on the rough bark. Mr. Wolf shook his head. "Dryads. They grow giddy at the sight of trees." "I don't recognize it," Dernick said with a slight frown. "It's not an oak." "Maybe it's some southern species," Barak suggested. "I've never seen one exactly like it myself." "He's very old," Sinedra said, putting her cheek fondly against the tree trunk. "And he speaks strangely, but he likes me." "What kind of tree is it?" Dernick asked. He was still frowning, his need to classify and categorize frustrated by the huge tree. "It's the only one of its kind in the world," Mr. Wolf told him. "I don't think we ever named it. It was always just the tree. We used to meet here sometimes." "It doesn't seem to drop any berries or fruit or seeds of any kind," Dernick observed, examining the ground beneath the spreading branches. "It doesn't need them," Wolf replied. "As I told you, it's the only one of its kind. It's always been here, and always will be. It feels no urge to propagate itself." Dernick seemed worried about it. "I've never heard of a tree with no seeds." "It's a rather special tree, Dernick," Aunt Pole said. "It sprouted on the day the world was made, and it will probably stand here for as long as the world exists. It has a purpose other than reproducing itself." "What purpose is that?" "We don't know," Wolf answered. He feels no treely urges. "We only know that it's the oldest living thing in the world. Maybe that's its purpose. Maybe it's here to demonstrate the continuity of life." Sinedra had removed her shoes and was climbing up into the thick branches, making little sounds of affection and delight. Mr. Wolf and Aunt Pole saying it's the oldest living thing in the world, and Sinedra's like, "I'm gonna climb it." "Is there, by any chance, a tradition linking dryads with squirrels?" Silk asked. Mr. Wolf smiled. "If the rest of you can manage without us, Garion and I have something to attend to." Aunt Pole looked questioningly at him. "It's time for a little instruction, Pole," he explained. "We can manage, Father," she said. "Will you be back in time for supper?" "Keep it warm for us. Coming, Garion?" The two of them rode in silence through the green meadows, with the golden afternoon sunlight making the entire vale warm and lovely. Garion was baffled by Mr. Wolf's curious change of mood. "You finished Clash of Kings and you're on Storm of Swords." Why did I say it like that? Swords. I really needed to get that W out, apparently. Storm of Swords. How many books are there? Is it a trilogy, or... It's nice that you've gotten through... Is that one or two you've read now? Like, are you on the second or the third book? Storm of Swords. Sharkies have never related to Sinedra so much as now. There are three, or you're on the third? You're on book 3. Okay, nice, nice. Yeah, you're moving through at a pretty good pace there. Hopefully that means you're enjoying them. Alright, so Garion was baffled by Mr. Wolf's curious change of mood. Always before, there had been a sort of impromptu quality about the old man. He seemed frequently to be making up his life as he went along, relying on chance, his wits, and his power, when necessary, to see him through. Here in the Vale, he seemed serene, undisturbed by the chaotic events taking place in the world outside. About 2 miles from the tree stood another tower. It was rather squat and round, and was built of rough stone. Arched windows near the top faced out in the directions of the 4 winds, but there seemed to be no door.
"You said you'd like to visit my tower,"
Wolf said, dismounting.
"This is it."
"It isn't ruined like the others."
"I take care of it from time to time. Shall we go up?"
Garion slid down from his horse. "Where's the door?" he asked.
"Right there."
Wolf pointed at a large stone in the rounded wall. Garion looked skeptical. So let's see. Wolf's Tower. Up here. So we've passed the tree, and now we're up at Belgrath's Tower. This map is definitely much more zoomed in. They're covering a lot more area on the map in a shorter amount of time. The Vale of Aldor is not that large compared to the countries they've been through. We've also definitely got more detail than we normally get on the map. Garion looked skeptical. Mr. Wolf stepped in front of the stone.
"It's me," he said. "Open."
The surge Garion felt at the old man's word seemed commonplace, ordinary, a household kind of surge that spoke of something that had been done so often that it was no longer a wonder. The rock turned obediently, revealing a sort of narrow, irregular doorway. Hank, it's me. Look at that, only one A on both of your Hanks. That's how normal it is. Motioning for Garion to follow, Wolf squeezed through into the dim chamber beyond the door. The tower, Garion saw, was not a hollow shell as he had expected, but rather was a solid pedestal, pierced only by a stairway winding upward.
"Come along,"
Wolf told him, starting up the worn stone steps.
"Watch that one,"
he said about halfway up, pointing at one of the steps.
"The stone is loose."
"Why don't you fix it?" Garion asked, stepping up over the loose stone.
"I've been meaning to, but I just haven't gotten around to it. It's been that way for a long time. I'm so used to it now that I never seem to think of fixing it when I'm here."
I appreciate the touches at making, this immortal sorcerer seem very normal. The chamber at the top of the tower was round and very cluttered. A thick coat of dust lay over everything. There were several tables in various parts of the room, covered with rolls and scraps of parchment, strange-looking implements and models, bits and pieces of rock and glass, and a couple of birds' nests. On one, a curious stick was so wound and twisted and coiled that Garion's eyes could not exactly follow its convolutions. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, trying to trace it out. "What's this? What's this, grandfather?" he asked.
"One of Polgara's toys,"
the old man said absently, staring around at the dusty chamber. "What's it supposed to do?"
"It kept her quiet when she was a baby. It's only got one end. She spent 5 years trying to figure it out.
Garion pulled his eyes off the fascinatingly compelling piece of wood. That's a cruel sort of thing to do to a child.
I had to do something,
Wolf answered. A Morbius stick, that's right.
I had to do something,
Wolf answered.
She had a penetrating voice as a child. Belgarion was a quiet, happy little girl, but your aunt never seemed satisfied.
Belgarion?
Your aunt's twin sister.
The old man's voice trailed off, and he looked sadly out of one of the windows for a few moments. Mobius. I definitely said Morbius, didn't I? Not Morbin time. That stick is Morbin all over the place. Mobius strip. Mobius. Oh boy. Oh boy. Okay. The old man's voice trailed off, and he looked sadly out of one of the windows for a few moments. Finally, he sighed and turned back to the round room.
I suppose I ought to clean this up a bit,
he said, looking around at the dust and litter. Let me help, Garion offered.
Just be careful not to break anything,
the old man warned.
Some of these things took me centuries to make.
He began moving around the chamber, picking things up and setting them down again, blowing now and then on them to clear away a bit of the dust. His efforts didn't really seem to be getting anywhere. I very much feel that. Finally, he stopped, staring at a low, rough-looking chair with the rail along its back, scarred and gashed as if it had been continually grasped by strong claws. He sighed again. What's wrong? Garion asked.
Poledra's chair,
Wolf said.
My wife. She used to perch there and watch me, sometimes for years on end.
Perch?
She was fond of the shape of the owl.
Oh. Garion had somehow never thought of the old man as ever having been married, although he obviously had to have been at some time. Kind of an assumption, since Aunt Pole and her twin sister were his daughters. Is that the first mention of Mrs. Wolf? Is it? It might be. No. It came up in one of the prologues, but maybe before we really knew him. Maybe it was in the first prologue. So it might have been before. It was probably in the first prologue. Probably before we really knew him as a character. Right. The shadowy wife's affinity for owls, however, explained Aunt Pole's own preference for that shape. The two women, Poledra and Belgarion, were involved rather intimately in his own background, he realized, but quite irrationally, he resented them. They had shared a part of the lives of his aunt and his grandfather that he would never, could never know. The old man moved a parchment and picked up a peculiar-looking device with a sighting glass in one end of it.
I thought I'd lost you,
he told the device, touching it with a familiar fondness.
You've been under that parchment all this time.
What is it? Garion asked him.
A thing I made when I was trying to discover the reason for mountains.
The reason?
Everything has a reason.
Wolf raised the instrument.
You see, what you do is...
He broke off and laid the device back on the table.
It's much too complicated to explain. I'm not even sure if I remember exactly how to use it myself. I haven't touched it since before Belzadar came to the Vale. When he arrived, I had to lay my studies aside to train him.
He looked around at the dust and clutter.
This is useless,
he said.
The dust will just come back anyway.
Were you alone here before Belzadar came?
My master was here. That's his tower over there.
Wolf pointed through the north window at a tall, slender stone structure about a mile away. Yep, there it is. Way up here, this one right there is labeled Aldor. Was he really here? Garion asked. I mean, not just his spirit.
No, he was really here. That was before the gods departed.
Did you live here always?
No, I came like a thief, looking for something to steal. Well, that's not actually true, I suppose. I was about your age when I came here, and I was dying at the time.
Dying? Garion was startled.
Freezing to death. I'd left the village I was born in the year before, after my mother died, and spent my first winter in the camp of the Godless Ones. They were very old by then.
Godless Ones? I was dying, said so casually. Well, it was 7,000 years prior, give or take. Godless Ones?
Ulgos, or rather the ones who decided not to follow Gorim to Prolgu. They stopped having children after that, so they were happy to take me in. I couldn't understand their language at the time, and all their pampering got on my nerves, so I ran away in the spring. I was on my way back the next fall, but I got caught in an early snowstorm not far from here. I lay down against the side of my master's tower to die. I didn't know it was a tower at first. With all the snow swirling around, it just looked like a pile of rock. As I recall, I was feeling rather sorry for myself at the time.
I can imagine. Garion shivered at the thought of being alone and dying. Angst! I was feeling sorry for myself. I feel like the described scenario is a understandable situation in which to feel angst.
I was sniveling a bit.
Angst.
And the sound disturbed my master. He let me in, probably more to quiet me than for any other reason. As soon as I got inside, I started looking for things to steal.
But he made you a sorcerer instead.
No, he made me a servant, a slave. I worked for him for 5 years before I even found out who he was. Sometimes I think I hated him, but I had to do what he told me to. I didn't really know why. The last straw came when he told me to move a big rock out of his way. I tried with all my strength, but I couldn't budge it. Finally, I got angry enough to move it with my mind instead of my back. That's what he'd been waiting for, of course. After that, we got along better. He changed my name from Garath to Belgarath, and he made me his pupil.
And his disciple?
That took a little longer. I had a lot to learn. I was examining the reason that certain stars fell at the time he first called me his disciple. And he was working on a round, gray stone he'd picked up by the riverbank.
Did you ever discover the reason that stars fall, I mean?
Yes, it's not all that complicated. It has to do with balance. The world needs a certain weight to keep it turning. When it starts to slow down, a few nearby stars fall. Their weight makes up the difference.
I never thought of that.
Neither did I. Not for quite some time.
What do you think? Is Belgarath just full of it there, or is that actually the way things work in this world? Because it definitely sounds like complete nonsense. It sounds like, I don't know, some philosopher's idea that never got brought before other people to argue about it. But who knows? This is a fantasy world. Maybe it actually works that way. I'm all fuzzy again. All right, so the stone you mentioned, was it?
The orb,
Wolf confirmed. Reminds you of the explanations Calvin's dad makes up in Calvin and Hobbes. I love that one comic about the record player. Look at this. The inside of the record, spins at the same speed as the outside, right? They're all one device, but the outside travels a much greater distance than the inside with the same revolutions. Calvin just being like,
the orb, Wolf confirmed. Just an ordinary rock until my master touched it. Anyway, I learned the secret of the will and the word, which isn't really that much of a secret after all. It's there in all of us. Or did I say that before?
I think so.
Probably so. I tend to repeat myself.
The old man picked up a roll of parchment and glanced at it, then laid it aside again.
So much that I started and haven't finished,
he sighed. Grandfather?
Yes, Garion?
This thing of ours, how much can you actually do with it?
That depends on your mind, Garion. The complexity of it lies in the complexity of the mind that puts it to use. Quite obviously, it can't do something that can't be imagined by the mind that focuses it. That was the purpose of our studies, to expand our minds so that we could use the power more fully.
Everybody's mind is different, though. Garion was struggling toward an idea.
Yes.
Wouldn't that mean that this thing... He shied away from the word power. What I mean is it different? Sometimes you do things, and other times you have Aunt Pole do them. Wolf nodded. Good writer forgetting what they've already explained in previous books cover up. Yeah, I'm kind of wondering if that I tend to repeat myself was related to the things we were wondering about in chapter 9 about, didn't we hear this story already? And what the Sharkies are saying. Yeah, I don't know. That,
If you knew you were going to live forever, would you just procrastinate more? Would you put things off even more so? Or would you double down and get things done sooner, I wonder? Probably not that one. Wolf nodded.
It's different in each one of us. There are certain things we can all do. We can all move things, for example.
Aunt Pole calls it trans... Garion hesitated, not remembering the word.
Translocation,
Wolf supplied.
moving something from one place to another. It's the simplest thing you can do. Usually the thing you do first. And it makes the most noise.
That's what she told me. Garion remembered the slave he had jerked from the river at this tour. The slave who had died.
Polgara can do things that I can't,
Wolf continued.
not because she's any stronger than I am, but because she thinks differently than I do. We're not sure how much you can do yet, because we don't know exactly how your mind works. You seem to be able to do certain things quite easily that I wouldn't even attempt. Maybe it's because you don't realize how difficult they are.
I don't quite understand what you mean. The old man looked at him.
Perhaps you don't at that. Remember the crazy monk who tried to attack you in that village in northern Tolnedra just after we left Arendia?
Garion nodded.
You cured his madness. That doesn't sound like much, until you realize that in the instant you cured him, you had to understand fully the nature of his insanity. That's an extremely difficult thing, and you did it without even thinking about it. And then, of course, there was the colt.
Garion glanced down through the window at the little horse friskily running through the field surrounding the tower.
The colt was dead, but you made him start to breathe. In order for you to do that, you had to be able to understand death.
It was just a wall, Garion explained. All I did was reach through it.
There's more to it than that, I think. What you seem to be able to do is to visualize extremely difficult ideas in very simple terms. That's a rare gift. But there are some dangers involved in it that you should be aware of.
Well, Sharkies, I think that's kind of the way it is in our world, too. If you think about it. Dangers? Such as what?
Don't oversimplify. If a man's dead, for example, he's usually dead for a very good reason, like a sword through the heart. If you bring him back, he'll only die immediately again anyway. As I said before, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should.
Garion sighed. I'm afraid this is going to take a very long time, grandfather, he said. I have to learn how to keep myself under control. I have to learn what I can't do so I don't kill myself trying to do something impossible. I have to learn what I can do and what I should do. I wish this had never happened to me.
We all do sometimes,
the old man told him.
The decision wasn't ours to make, though. I haven't always liked some of the things I've had to do, and neither has your aunt. But what we're doing is more important than we are. So, we do what's expected of us, like it or not.
What if I just said, no, I won't do it?
You could do that, I suppose. But you won't, will you?
Garion sighed again. No, he said, I guess not. The old sorcerer put his arm around the boy's shoulders.
I thought you might see things that way, Belgarion. You're bound to this the same way we all are.
The strange thrill he always felt at the sound of his other, secret name ran through Garion. Why do you all insist on calling me that? He asked.
Belgarion,
Wolf said mildly.
Think, boy. Think what it means. I haven't been talking to you and telling you stories all these years just because I like the sound of my own voice.
Garion turned it over carefully in his mind. You were Garath, he mused thoughtfully, but the god Aldur changed your name to Belgarath. Zedar was Zedar first, and then Belzedar, and then he went back to being Zedar again.
And in my old tribe, Polgara would have just been Gara. Pol is like Bel. The only difference is that she's a woman. Her name comes from mine, because she's my daughter. Your name comes from mine, too.
Garion, Garath, the boy said. Belgarath, Belgarion. It all fits together, doesn't it?
Naturally,
the old man replied.
I'm glad you noticed it.
But he does like the sound of his own voice, yeah. They did call him Storyteller before he got the wolf name. Garion grinned at him. Then a thought occurred. But I'm not really Belgarion yet, am I?
Not entirely. You still have a way to go.
I suppose I'd better get started then. Garion said it with a certain ruefulness. Since I don't really have any choice.
Somehow I knew that eventually you'd come around,
Mr. Wolf said. Don't you sometimes wish that I was just Garion again, and you were the old storyteller coming to visit Faldor's farm? Speaking of. With Aunt Pole making supper in the kitchen as she did in the old days, and we were hiding under a haystack with a bottle I'd stolen for you? Garion felt the homesickness welling up in him.
Sometimes, Garion, sometimes,
Wolf admitted, his eyes far away. We won't ever be able to go back there again, will we?
Not the same way, no.
I'll be Belgarion, and you'll be Belgarath. We won't even be the same people anymore.
Everything changes, Garion,
Belgarath told him. Show me the rock, Garion said suddenly.
Which rock?
The one Aldur made you move, the day you first discovered the power.
Oh,
Belgarath said.
That rock. It's right over there. The white one. The one the colt's sharpening his hooves on.
It's a very big rock.
I'm glad you appreciate that,
Belgarath replied modestly.
I thought so myself.
Do you suppose I could move it?
You never know until you try, Garion,
Belgarath told him. That's the end of chapter 10. That was a cute chapter. It's nice to have Garion and Belgarath spend a long period, like a big chunk of time together, and have a long conversation that isn't too emotionally charged, that isn't somebody being upset with somebody else. Just having a normal, sort of, normal chat. Alright, I did say I was going to read 2 chapters today, and I think chapter 11's a little shorter. So I'm going to jump right into it. Chapter 11. On page 119. The next morning, when Garion awoke, he knew immediately that he was not alone. "Where have you been?" he asked silently. "I've been watching," the other consciousness in his mind said. "I see that you've finally come around. What choice did I have?" "None. You'd better get up. Aldor's coming." Garion quickly rolled out of his blankets. "Here? Are you sure?" The voice in his mind didn't answer. Garion put on a clean tunic and hose and wiped off his half-boots with a certain amount of care. Then he went out of the tent he shared with Silk and Dernick. Not that their tents have ever come up very much other than setting up and taking them down and getting stuff out of them, but this is the first time I think it's ever really mentioned Garion sharing his tent with Silk and Dernick. There are certain, the way that this story is told, I feel like there are certain details that really don't get touched on very much. For instance, since Hetar joined them, they've had these Belgarion horses they've been riding, and those have almost been described in no detail other than the colt. Garion has had no attachment to the horse he's been riding. It hasn't been named or really even described. It's sort of an odd aspect that I feel like you would expect more in modern storytelling, in modern books. If somebody spent this much time riding a horse, I would expect it to get described at some point. The sun was just coming up over the high mountains to the east, and the line between sunlight and shadow moved with a stately ponderousness across the dewy grass of the vale. Not at all how the sunlight would get described in a Discworld book. Sharky was thinking about these books as you were camping and just how much work adventuring would be. It took 2 vehicles for us to bring all the stuff for 4 people to camp for 3 nights, but an adventuring party would have to travel a lot lighter and pick up more food and wood along the way. Yeah, I mean, they've sort of glossed over the routines that they go through, but we've seen Garion and Dernick go and gather firewood, get water from streams. I guess they kind of count on having relatively frequent access to clean water. Not much description of hunting since Leldoran's brief stint with the party. Yeah, and the run-in with the boars behind that, but even that was more of a sport type thing. So really not much talk of food gathering. Though we have seen them get supplies whenever they've visited towns and things like that. They have gone shopping. And we know that Aunt Pole's got pots and pans and medical supplies, pots of spices, things like that. So I guess they carry a lot of food. And they do have pack horses, right? So they've, they don't just have the horses they're riding. They also have some that are just laden with gear. And we don't know how many, but there was actually a mention of the pack horses not that long ago. When Hetar wandered off, they said, it's not like him to leave the pack horses unattended. But they probably don't carry... I'm sure they packed wood up into the mountains, but they probably don't carry wood all the time. As a thought. Anyways... Aunt Pole and Belgarath stood near the small fire where a pot was just beginning to bubble. They were talking quietly, and Garion joined them. You're up early, Aunt Pole said. She reached out and smoothed his hair. I was awake, he replied. He looked around, wondering from which direction Aldor would come. Your grandfather tells me that the two of you had a long talk yesterday. Garion nodded. I understand a few things a little better now. I'm sorry I've been so difficult. She drew him to her and put her arms around him. It's all right, dear. You had some hard decisions to make. You're not angry with me then? Of course not, dear. The others had begun to get up, coming out of their tents, yawning and stretching and rumpled looking. What do we do today? Silk asked, coming to the fire and rubbing the sleep from his eyes.
We wait,
Belgarath told him.
My master said he'd meet us here.
I'm curious to see him. I've never met a god before. Thy curiosity, methinks, will soon be satisfied, Prince Keldar, Mandoralin said. Look there. Coming across the meadow not far from the great tree beneath which they had pitched their tents, a figure in a blue robe was approaching. A soft nimbus of blue light surrounded the figure, and the immediate sense of presence made it instantly clear that what approached was not a man. Garion was not prepared for the impact of that presence. His meeting with the spirit of Issa in Queen Selmisra's throne room had been clouded by the narcotic effects of the things the Serpent Queen had forced him to drink. Similarly, half his mind had slept during the confrontation with Mara in the ruins of Mar Amon. But now, fully awake in the first light of morning, he found himself in the presence of a god. Aldor's face was kindly and enormously wise. His long hair and beard were white, from conscious choice, Garion felt, rather than from any result of age. The face was very familiar to him somehow. It bore a startling resemblance to Belgarath's, but Garion perceived immediately, with a sudden curious inversion of his original notion, that it was Belgarath who resembled Aldor, as if their centuries of association had stamped Aldor's features upon the face of the old man. There were differences, of course. That certain mischievous roguishness was not present on the calm face of Aldor. That quality was Belgarath's own, the last remnant, perhaps, of the face of the thieving boy Aldor had taken into his tower on a snowy day some 7,000 years ago.
Master,
Belgarath said, bowing respectfully as Aldor approached. Let me try and figure out an Aldor voice. Belgarath, the god acknowledged. His voice was very quiet. I have not seen thee in some time. The years have not been unkind to thee. Belgarath shrugged wryly.
Some days I feel them more than others, master. I carry a great number of years with me.
Aldor smiled and turned to Aunt Pole. My beloved daughter, he said fondly, reaching out to touch the white lock at her brow. Thou art as lovely as ever. And thou as kind, master, she replied, smiling and inclining her head. There passed among the three of them a kind of intensely personal linkage, a joining of minds that marked their reunion. Garion could feel the edges of it with his own mind, and he was somewhat wistful at being excluded, though he realized at once that there was no intent to exclude him. They were merely re-establishing an eons-old companionship, shared experiences that stretched back into antiquity. Aldor then turned to look at the others. "And so you have come together at last, as it hath been foretold from the beginning of days you should. You are the instruments of destiny, and my blessing goes with each of you, as you move toward that awful day when the universe will become one again." It's an odd phrasing, isn't it? That awful day when the universe will become one again. The faces of Garion's companions were awed and puzzled by Aldor's enigmatic blessing. Each, however, bowed with profound respect and humility. Awful as in full of awe? I don't know. Maybe awful as in grand? But, I don't know. One of those things that's so big that it can only be described as, like, terrible. Maybe. And then Sinedra emerged from the tent she shared with Aunt Pole. The tiny girl stretched luxuriantly and ran her fingers through the tumbled mass of her flaming hair. She was dressed in a dryad tunic and sandals. Of course, she slept through Aldor arriving. "Sinedra," Aunt Pole called her, "come here." "Yes, Lady Polgara," the little princess replied obediently. She crossed to the fire, her feet seeming barely to touch the ground. Then she saw Aldor, standing with the others, and stopped, her eyes wide. "This is our master, Sinedra," Aunt Pole told her. "He wanted to meet you." The princess stared at the glowing presence in confusion. Nothing in her life had prepared her for such a meeting. She lowered her eyelashes and then looked up shyly, her tiny face artfully and automatically assuming its most appealing expression. Aldor smiled gently. "She's like a flower that charms without knowing it." His eyes looked deeply into those of the princess. "There is steel in this one, however. She is fit for her task. My blessings upon thee, my child." Sinedra responded with an instinctively graceful curtsy. It was the first time Garion had ever seen her bow to anyone. Aldor turned then and to look full at Garion. A brief, unspoken acknowledgment passed between the god and the consciousness that shared Garion's thoughts. There was, in that momentary meeting, a sense of mutual respect and of shared responsibility. And then Garion felt the massive touch of Aldor's mind upon his own, and knew that the god had instantly seen and understood his every thought and feeling. "Hail, Belgarion," Aldor said gravely. "Master," Garion replied. He dropped to one knee, not really knowing why. "We have awaited thy coming since time's beginning. Thou art the vessel of all our hopes." Aldor raised his hand. "My blessing, Belgarion. I am well pleased with thee." Garion's entire being was suffused with love and gratitude as the warmth of Aldor's benediction filled him. But no pressure. Well, you have both him applying that, like, Yep, you've got a big task ahead of you, but also, I am well pleased with thee. It's nice to hear that coming from a god. Dear Polgara, Aldor said to Aunt Pole, thy gift to us is beyond value. Belgarion has come at last, and the world trembles at his coming. Aunt Pole bowed again. Let us now go apart, Aldor said to Belgarath and Aunt Pole. Your task is well begun, but I must now provide you with that instruction I promised when first I set your steps upon this path. That which was once clouded becomes clearer, and now we can see what lies before us. Let us look toward that day we have all awaited, and make our preparations. The three of them moved away from the fire, and it seemed to Garion that, as they went, the glowing nimbus which had surrounded Aldor now enclosed Aunt Pole and his grandfather as well. Some movement or sound distracted his eye for a moment, and when he looked back, the three had vanished. Barak let out his breath explosively.
Belar! That was something to see.
Not Belar, Aldor.
We have been favored, I think, beyond all men, Mandaralin said.
They all stood, staring at each other, caught up in the wonder of what they had just witnessed. Sinedra, however, broke the mood. All right, she ordered peremptorily. Don't just stand there gaping. Move away from the fire. What are you going to do? Garion asked her. The Lady Polgara's going to be busy, the little girl said loftily. So I'm going to make breakfast. The explosive breath. Oh boy. Barak let his breath out explosively. Yep. She moved toward the fire with a business-like bustling. Well, I think we all know how this is going to go. The bacon was not too badly burned, but Sinedra's attempt to toast slices of bread before the open fire turned out disastrously, and her porridge had lumps in it as solid as clods in a sun-baked field. Garion and the others, however, ate what she offered without comment, prudently avoiding the direct gaze she leveled at them, as if daring them to speak so much as one word of criticism. I wonder how long they're going to be, Silk said after breakfast.
Gods, I think, have little notion of time,
Barak replied sagely, stroking at his beard.
I don't expect them back until sometime this afternoon at the earliest.
It's a good time to check over the horses, Hetar decided. Some of them have picked up a few burrs along the way, and I'd like to have a look at their hooves, just to be on the safe side. I'll help you, Dernick offered, getting up. Hetar nodded, and the two went off to the place where the horses were picketed.
And I've got a nick or two in my sword edge,
Barak remembered, fishing a piece of polishing stone out of his belt and laying his heavy blade across his lap. Mandaralin went to his tent and brought out his armor. He laid it out on the ground and began a minute inspection for dents and spots of rust. Silk rattled a pair of dice hopefully in one hand, looking inquiringly at Barak.
If it's all the same to you, I think I'd like to enjoy the company of my money for a while longer,
the big man told him. This whole place absolutely reeks of domesticity. 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 Domestic. Domesticity. Too many sisses. Domesticity. La, la, la. Domesticity. This place absolutely reeks of domesticity. There we go. That's the one. Domesticness. I don't know. It says domesticity. Maybe that's why I had so much trouble with it. Silk complained. Then he sighed, put away his dice, and went to fetch a needle and thread and a tunic he'd torn on a bush up in the mountains. You're trying to give me... I see. You know, I actually kind of appreciate this bit. Taking care of the horses, taking care of your weapons, taking care of your armor, Silk sewing up a rip in one of his tunics. These are details that you don't frequently get in, you know, adventure movies and other books and things, especially books that aren't spread out quite so much. That's something that I like about the 5-book format that this series takes. It's kind of like watching a TV show versus a movie, right? You get more time for smaller details, like everyday things. I enjoy that. I think that's something that some of my my favorite books have in common. Some of them, anyways. There's a whole series by Ellie. Let me just confirm. I want to say Ellie Modesset, but I might be mixing up authors. I think it's Ellie Modesset. Called the Saga of Recluse. That I think is maybe a little slow for some people, but I enjoy it because it's a little slower and because it's got sort of, I think, more space for kind of details of everyday life sometimes. You had a lot of details about the protagonist's professions frequently, as, you know, a cooper or a carpenter or a blacksmith. And their, you know, struggles with attracting clients and things like that sometimes. And then, you know, it's also a grand adventure with magic and things like that. So, anyways... So, went to fetch a needle and thread and a tunic he'd torn on a bush up in the mountains. Sinedra had returned to her communion with the vast tree and was scampering among the branches, taking what Garion felt to be inordinate risks as she jumped from limb to limb with a cat-like unconcern. After watching her for a few moments, Garion watching Sinedra for once, he fell into a kind of reverie, thinking back to the awesome meeting that morning. He had met the gods, Issa and Mara, already, but there was something special about Aldur. The affinity Belgarath and Aunt Pol showed so obviously for this god who had always remained aloof from men spoke loudly to Garion. The devotional activities of Sendaria, where he had been raised, were inclusive rather than exclusive. A good Sendar prayed impartially and honored all the gods, even Torak. That is interesting looking back at it. Back then we didn't really understand the divide between the gods so thoroughly, but when they did their prayers at Faldor's farm and they did the little play, the, what's it called? I've got, the word is almost complete in my mind, but it's, anyways, they had, you know, the gods come in one by one and announce who they were and give their blessing, and even Torak with his steel mask. No, not pantomime, that's not it. Specifically, a play about gods. Isn't there a word for that? Or am I just making things up? I wonder if Google can give me that answer.
I thought of pantheon, but I thought there was a specific word for sort of like featuring the pan sort of thing. I thought there was something. Maybe I'm just making it up. Oh, anyways. So, where was I? The devotional activities of Sendaria, where he had been raised, were inclusive rather than exclusive. A good Sendar prayed impartially and honored all the gods, even Torak. Garion now, however, felt a special closeness and reverence for Aldur, and the adjustment in his theological thinking required a certain amount of thought. A twig dropped out of the tree onto his head, and he glanced up with annoyance. Sinedra, grinning impishly, was directly over his head. "Boy," she said in her most superior and insulting tone, "the breakfast dishes are getting cold. The grease is going to be difficult to wash off if you let it harden." "I'm not your scullion," he told her. "Wash the dishes, Garion," she ordered him, nibbling at the tip of a lock of her hair. "Wash them yourself." She glared down at him, biting rather savagely at the unoffending lock. "Why do you keep chewing on your hair like that?" he asked irritably. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, removing the lock from between her teeth. "Every time I look at you, you've got your hair stuck in your mouth." "I do not," she retorted indignantly. "Are you going to wash the dishes?" "No." He squinted up at her. The short dryad tunic she was wearing seemed to expose an unseemly amount of leg. "Why don't you go put on some clothes?" he suggested. "Some of us don't appreciate the way you run around half naked all the time." The fight got underway almost immediately after that. Finally, Garion gave up his efforts to get in the last word and stamped away in disgust. "Garion!" she screamed after him. "Don't you dare go off and leave me with all these dirty dishes!" He ignored her and kept walking. I think she's at least partly in the right here, you know? She does the cooking. It's only fair for someone else to help with cleaning. I say help with, but do the cleaning. He ignored her and kept walking. After a short distance, he felt a familiar nuzzling at his elbow, and he rather absently scratched the colt's ears. The small animal quivered with delight and rubbed against him affectionately. Then, unable to restrain himself any more, the colt galloped off into the meadow to pester a family of docilely feeding rabbits. Garion found himself smiling. The morning was just too beautiful to allow the squabble with the princess to spoil it. There was, it seemed, something rather special about the vale. The world grew cold with the approach of winter and was buffeted by storms and dangers. But here it seemed as if the hand of Aldur stretched protectively above them, filling this special place with warmth and peace and a kind of eternal and magical serenity. Garion,
at this point in his life, needed all the warmth and peace he could get. There were things that had to be worked out, and he needed a time, however brief, without storms and dangers to deal with them. He was halfway to Belgarath's tower before he realized that it had been there that he had been going all along. The tall grass was wet with dew, and his boots were soon soaked, but even that did not spoil the day. He walked around the tower several times, gazing up at it. Although he found the stone that marked the door quite easily, he decided not to open it. It would not be proper to go uninvited into the old man's tower, and beyond that, he was not entirely certain that the door would respond to any voice but Belgarath's. He stopped quite suddenly at that last thought and started searching back, trying to find the exact instant when he had ceased to think of his grandfather as Mr. Wolf, and had finally accepted the fact that he was Belgarath. The changeover seemed significant, a kind of turning point. Still lost in thought, he turned then and walked across the meadow toward the large white rock the old man had pointed out to him from the tower window. Absently, he put one hand on it and pushed. The rock didn't budge. Garion set both hands on it and pushed again, but the rock remained motionless. He stepped back and considered it. It wasn't really a vast boulder. It was rounded and white, and not quite as high as his waist. Heavy, certainly, but it should not be so inflexibly solid. He bent over to look at the bottom, and then he understood. The underside of the rock was flat. It would never roll. The only way to move it would be to lift one side and tip it over. He walked around the rock, looking at it from every angle. He judged that it was marginally movable. If he exerted every ounce of his strength, he might be able to lift it. He sat down and looked at it, thinking hard. As he sometimes did, he talked to himself, trying to lay out the problem. Have we ever seen Garion talk to himself before? The first thing to do is to try to move it, he concluded. Well, yeah. It doesn't really look totally impossible. Then, if that doesn't work, we'll try it the other way. He stood up, stepped purposefully to the rock. Oh, Bookspurs and Booze is heading to bed. All right, well, thank you for joining us. Happy Friday. I hope you have a good weekend. Have a good sleep. See you next week. Bye, BBAB. Good night. He stood up, stepped purposefully to the rock, wormed his fingers under the edge of it, and heaved. Nothing happened. Have to try a little harder, he told himself. He spread his feet and set himself. He began to lift again, straining, the cords standing out in his neck. For the space of about 10 heartbeats, he tried as hard as he could to lift the stubborn rock. Not to roll it over, he'd given that up after the first instant, but simply to make it budge, to acknowledge his existence. Though the ground was not particularly soft there, his feet actually sank a fraction of an inch or so as he strained against the rock's weight. His head was swimming, and little dots seemed to swirl in front of his eyes as he released the rock and collapsed, gasping, against it. He lay against the cold, gritty surface for several minutes, recovering. "All right," he said finally. "Now we know that that won't work." he stepped back and sat down. Each time he'd done something with his mind before, it had been on impulse, a response to some crisis. He had never sat down and deliberately worked himself up to it. He discovered almost at once that the entire set of circumstances was completely different. The whole world seemed suddenly filled with distractions. Birds sang, a breeze brushed his face, an ant crawled across his hand. Each time he began to bring his will to bear, something pulled his attention away. There was a certain feeling to it, he knew that, a tightness in the back of his head, and a sort of pushing out with his forehead. He closed his eyes, and that seemed to help. It was coming. It was slow, but he felt the will begin to build in him. Remembering something, he reached inside his tunic and put the mark on his palm against the amulet. The force within him, amplified by that touch, built to a great roaring crescendo. He kept his eyes closed and stood up. Then he opened his eyes and looked hard at the stubborn white rock. "You will move," he muttered. He kept his right hand on the amulet and held out his left hand, palm up. "Now," he said sharply, and slowly began to raise his left hand in a lifting motion. I do know what's coming in the chat. The force within him surged, and the roaring sound inside his head became deafening. Slowly, the edge of the rock came up out of the grass. Worms and burrowing grubs, who had lived out their lives in the safe, comfortable darkness under the rock, flinched as the morning sunlight hit them. Ponderously, the rock raised, obeying Garion's inexorably lifting hand. It teetered for a second on its edge, then slowly toppled over. The exhaustion he had felt after trying to lift the rock with his back was nothing compared to the bone-deep weariness that swept over him after he let the clenching of his will relax. He folded his arms on the grass and let his head sink down on them. After a moment or two, that peculiar fact began to dawn on him. He was still standing, but his arms were folded comfortably in front of him on the grass. He jerked his head up and looked around in confusion. He had moved the rock, certainly. That much was obvious, since the rock now lay on its rounded top, with its damp underside turned up. Something else had also happened, however. Though he had not touched the rock, its weight had nonetheless been upon him as he had lifted it, and the force he had directed at it had not all gone at the rock. With dismay, Garion realized that he had sunk up to his armpits in the firm soil of the meadow. "Now what do I do?" he asked himself helplessly. He shuddered away from the idea of once again mustering his will to pull himself out of the ground. He was too exhausted even to consider it. He tried to wriggle, thinking that he might be able to loosen the earth around him and work his way up an inch at a time, but he could not so much as budge. "Look what you've done," he accused the rock. The rock ignored him. A thought occurred to him. "Are you in there?" he asked that awareness that seemed always to have been with him. The silence in his mind was profound.
Ugh.
"Help!" he shouted. A bird, attracted by the exposed worms and bugs that had been under the rock, cocked one eye at him and then went back to its breakfast. Garion heard a light step behind him and craned around, trying to see. The colt was staring at him in amazement. Hesitantly, the small horse thrust out his nose and nuzzled Garion's face. "Good horse," Garion said, relieved not to be alone at least. An idea came to him. "You're going to have to go get Hetar," he told the colt. That's an odd thought, Sharkies. "You're going to have to go get Hetar," he told the colt. The colt pranced about and nuzzled his face again. "Stop that," Garion commanded. "This is serious." Cautiously, he tried to push his mind into the colt's thoughts. He tried a dozen different ways until he finally struck the right combination by sheer accident. Upon consultation, you were both picturing it. I don't remember ever having that thought. But then again, I didn't read it out loud the first time, so maybe I sped through. The colt's mind flitted from here to there without purpose or pattern. It was a baby's mind, vacant of thought, receiving only sense impressions. Garion caught flickering images of green grass and running and clouds in the sky and warm milk. He also felt the sense of wonder in the little mind and the abiding love the colt had for him. Slowly, painfully, Garion began constructing a picture of Hetar in the colt's wandering thoughts. It seemed to take forever. "Hetar," Garion said over and over. "Go get Hetar. Tell him that I'm in trouble." The colt scampered around and came back to stick his soft nose in Garion's ear. "Please pay attention," Garion cried. "Please!" Finally, after what seemed hours, the colt seemed to understand. He went several paces away, then came back to nuzzle Garion again. "Go get Hetar," Garion ordered, stressing each word. The colt pawed at the ground, then turned and galloped away, going in the wrong direction. Garion started to swear. For almost a year now, he had been exposed to some of the more colorful parts of Barak's vocabulary. After he had repeated all the phrases he remembered 6 or 8 times, he began to extemporize. A flickering thought came back to him from the now vanished colt. The little beast was chasing butterflies. Garion pounded the ground with his fists, wanting to howl with frustration. The sun rose higher, and it started to get hot. It was early afternoon when Hetar and Silk, following the prancing little colt, found him. Hetar and Silk. "How in the world did you manage to do that?" Silk asked curiously. "I don't want to talk about it," Garion muttered, somewhere between relief and total embarrassment. He probably can do many things that we can't, Hatar observed, climbing down from his horse and untying Dernick's shovel from his saddle. The thing I can't understand, though, is why he'd want to do it. I'm positive he had a good reason for it, Silk assured him. Do you think we should ask him? It's probably very complicated, Silk replied. I'm sure simple men like you and me wouldn't be able to understand it. Do you suppose he's finished with whatever it is he's doing? We could ask him, I suppose. I wouldn't want to disturb him, Hatar said. It could be very important. It almost has to be, Silk agreed. Will you please get me out of here? Garion begged. Are you sure you're finished? Silk asked politely. We can wait if you're not done yet. Please, Garion asked, almost in tears. And that's the end of chapter 11. I'm going to stop now because it's past 9 o'clock and I'm getting hungry. I love that scene. It's just so ridiculous. The little beast was chasing butterflies. Sharky saying that that's like trying to wrangle a toddler for you. But Silk came along just to see the spectacle. Imagine the scene when the colt finally found Hatar. And Hatar going like, Garion is just arms and head on the ground? What's happening here? Marmos is having a hard time keeping quiet. Hatar isn't usually this sassy. As someone who once got stuck past your knees in a mud hole, it's a worse situation than you first assume. Yeah, trying to get your feet out of mud without losing your boots in the process is if they're not tied very tightly, that's a frightening prospect. And then we consider that it wasn't even described, like it was not particularly soft ground when he was trying to lift the rock physically the first time. So he's probably packed right in. One friend went to get your mom and another got a random neighbor who dug you out with a shovel. Oh, wow. Kind of almost similar. Oh, look, Hatar. He's nice. Oh, yeah. I have a message for Hatar. Oh, I see. Oh, look, Hatar. He's nice. Oh, yeah. I have a message for Hatar. From Garion. I love Garion. He's so great. Right. Garion's in trouble. Get help from Hatar. I like Hatar. Garion. Garion? Harion? Hey. I'm hungry. Oh, boy. Oh, that whole chapter. Those two chapters, actually. I really enjoy those two chapters. That whole, like, things have been complicated and messy for so long, and then you get this moment of peacefulness. And Garion even describes it himself, and he kind of needs a moment where he's not in the middle of a storm to sort things out a little bit. Oh, look, a butterfly. Yeah. So these two chapters were nice. A little bit of eventfulness. We met another god. But, just some nice, quiet, getting a bit of, like, Belgarath's history. And seeing a side of Belgarath that we don't see very often. That, like, scientific side. Him doing studies and trying to figure out the way the world works. Why do stars fall from the sky? You don't see that side of Belgarath very often during this adventure. So it's interesting to get a glimpse of what he's like when there aren't pressing, world-shattering, matters to attend to. After he chased butterflies, imagine the Cultist having the mind of SpongeBob SquarePants. Well, like Garion said, he is just a baby. He was born like 2 weeks ago, something like that. Arms on the ground. What? He has been disarmed? Garion, his arms on the ground, when the walls fell. Garion, the rock flipped over. Garion and Colt at the tower. The Colt chasing butterflies. Garion, when the rock flipped. Well, at least we can say one thing for Garion. At least he didn't get in over his head. Huh? Oh boy. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't see anyone that I have on my list streaming right now. So I am gonna just wrap things up for the evening. This was fun. Nice way to start the weekend with some calm, relaxing chapters. Not even a cliffhanger or anything. You're actually worried that he would drop it and the rock would fall on him. Well, he wasn't pulling it towards himself, so it would have had to like drop and roll back. Turned out much lovelier than you thought. Yeah, a little bit of humor in this chapter. These chapters, just sort of some nice conversations and a little bit of history and some frolicking in a meadow with a colt chasing butterflies. Go get Hadar. This is serious. I feel like Silk is just absolutely the worst person. Maybe the second worst to have found him. The worst probably would have been Sinedra. Oh boy. So look forward to next chapter, because I wouldn't be surprised if the others got a telling of this story. Go get Hadar and stop laughing. Alright. Well, have a good weekend, everybody. Good luck with the birthdays and Zoom meetings and everything else. I'll be back next Wednesday. I don't think, assuming that, like, we haven't sold our house over the weekend and aren't, like, frantically moving our stuff into storage or anything like that. But I should be back next Wednesday. There is a possibility from this point onward where I might just abruptly have to miss an unknown number of streams if our house sells. I mean, most likely wherever we end up staying temporarily, we'll probably have internet access, and so I'll maybe be able to set up a temporary rig. But yeah, definitely a little uncertainty from here on, but I will try to let you know if anything changes. But yeah, I enjoyed this. Have a good weekend. Have a good night. And see you next week, hopefully. Bye. Good night.